almost busted in Laredo, but for reasons that I'd rather not disclose.
I smoke pot, and I like it a lot. Hi, this is Willie Nelson. I learned a long time ago that marijuana is a lot safer to use than alcohol. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana by adults. It's time we stopped arresting and started respecting responsible marijuana smokers in America. And to learn what you can do to help, please contact NORML at www.norml.org or call toll-free at 888-67-NORML.
The show was long and we were just sitting there, and we'd come to play and not just for the ride.
And distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. This is your daily audio stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular audio podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about the show at our website, NORMLAudiostash.com. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. Welcome back to the Audio Stash. Today, it is Thursday, May 31st. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Take a moment to join us at NORML to end marijuana prohibition in America. Just visit NORML.org to get involved today. We're going to open up our stash right away today with breaking news from NORML. Breaking news today from the NORML Foundation in Washington, D.C. via Dale Geringer at California NORML. Jury returns mixed verdict in Ed Rosenthal trial. A federal jury rendered a mixed verdict in the recent trial of Ed Rosenthal. Rosenthal was found innocent on one count of manufacture and possession for sale for the Harm Reduction Center in San Francisco. The jury was hung on another count of conspiracy, but Rosenthal was found guilty on 3 counts: manufacture and possession for sale, conspiracy to manufacture, and maintaining a place where marijuana is grown. The jurors were again barred in this trial from hearing any testimony regarding medical marijuana or the fact that Rosenthal was producing marijuana with the consent of the city of Oakland. Cultivation of medical marijuana is legal under California state law with Proposition 215. The judge in the trial, Charles Breyer, had sentenced Rosenthal to a single day in jail following his prior convictions on the same counts. The judge urged the federal prosecutor in California not to continue to pursue the charges against Rosenthal, promising the prosecutor earlier this year that he would not sentence any jail time for Rosenthal, even if a jury returned a conviction. We'll have more on this story in tomorrow's Audio Stash. You can listen to our Audio Stash interview with Ed Rosenthal in April right on our homepage at NORMLAudiostash.com.
1,000 million years ago, nature said, let it grow, grow more weed. I've got no race problem, I've got no age problem, I've got no problems when I'm stoned, so I'll grow more weed.
This week and next week here on NORML's Daily Audio Stash, we're going to take an inside look at the prison culture of America. It's important to understand why we have this system of incarceration, a system that many say is really going wrong, and how much drug policy comes into play, and how many hundreds of thousands of Americans get sent into this system every year, particularly for marijuana. Folks, the U.S. has millions of citizens in prison every day. That's right, millions. In fact, we have more prisoners than any other country on earth. States are struggling with severe prison overcrowding at almost every level, yet politicians and the public, to some degree, continue to push incarceration as the main deterrent to crime. Further, no one in America has any expectation that prisons rehabilitate. Indeed, the brutality of the prison experience in America seems well understood by everyone, with the reasons for our prison culture not so well understood. Joining us today and again next week is author Sasha Abramsky. His newest book is American Furies: Crime, Punishment, and Vengeance in the Age of Mass Imprisonment. We have links to it on our website today at normalaudiostash.com. Sasha interviewed hundreds of prisoners and prison officials to write this book, and he offers some surprising insights into the broader impact of having so many prisoners on our whole culture. Sasha, welcome here to the Audio Stash today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks again for joining us here, Sasha. Some are calling the United States a prison state now, akin to the Soviet Union. So, why does that moniker somewhat fit? How many prisoners do we have?
There are about 2.2 million people, so about 1% of the adult population live behind bars on any given day. They're either in prison or they're in jails in local counties. And the reason I think people are talking about a prison culture, increasingly what we're seeing is our social policy is being defined by our incarceration structures. So our approach to drugs, our approach to the mentally ill, our approach to the homeless, increasingly we rely on the usage of prisons to deal with these groups. And what that means is there's a tremendous number of people living in prisons. There's a tremendous number of people whose family members are living in prisons. And there's a huge number of people who either work in prisons or, again, their mother or their father works in prison. And they bring home with them every evening the culture of the prison. It's obviously a violent culture. It's an uncouth culture. It promotes depression, it promotes alcoholism and drug abuse. So when you add all of that together, and for me as a journalist, this is what's fascinated me in the last few years about this. When you add it all together, you're not just seeing some sort of corner of American life, you're actually increasingly seeing a central aspect of American life. And I'm hoping that my book is a story about America rather than a story about prisons.
Sasha, in American Furies, you look at the politics that surround this prison culture of America. I was particularly struck with this one prison official from Mississippi who you quote, and he says here, quote, "Good politics doesn't always make good public policy," close quote. I think that's a very telling statement. Do you think it's purely politics that have gotten us into the situation we have today?
Well, I think in part it is, and the person you're referring to is a man called Don Cabana, and he has been in many, many senior positions in the prison system. He was, at the time I talked with him, a warden or a recent ex-warden at Parchman Prison in Mississippi, and it gets very hot there. It's in the Mississippi Delta. And he was talking about how in the summer, inside the cell blocks, it can get to about 110 degrees and almost pure humidity. But because it sounds like it's soft on criminals, politicians have decided that they don't want fans in these cell blocks. They want to be tough on criminals instead of soft on criminals. And so they've removed the fans from the cell blocks. So these prisoners sit in this extraordinary heat. And what Cabana and other prison administrators told me is this makes lousy public policy because it makes the prisoners bitter, it makes the prisons hard to control, it contributes to this culture of violence, and it doesn't actually do anything for public safety in the long run. I've been thinking about this for the last few weeks as I've started doing interviews for my book, and I think one of the things that we've done in the last 20 or 25 years is we've ceded the language of politics to very conservative social forces, and that goes for whether we're talking about crime or whether we're talking about abortion rights or whether we're talking about welfare. We've allowed a hard, soft language to emerge in which the conservatives by default are allowed to be hard on issues. And that by default means that progressives are squidgy and soft on issues. And I was thinking about this in the context of crime, and it seems to me that something extraordinary has happened. We've allowed some really, really bad, destructive, and very, very expensive public policies to be put into the social system under the rubric of quote-unquote tough on crime. So an example in California, under the rubric of tough on crime, there's a law in California called 3 strikes and you're out. And that says if you have an offender with 2 quote-unquote serious felonies in their past, and it's fairly broadly defined as to what's a serious felony, any 3rd felony can qualify somebody for a life sentence. So you have thousands of inmates in California whose 3rd felony involves something like drug possession or very, very low-end welfare fraud. And they're put in prison for 25 years to life, and it costs $50,000 a year in California to lock up an inmate. So if you put a man, let's say he's 30 years old, and you put him in prison, and you say you're going to spend the next 30 or 40 years of your life in prison for this crime, even if you set aside the moral problems with that, financially, you're basically dumping the taxpayer with a $3 or $4 million bill to pay for that person for the rest of his life. But we've allowed that to be called tough on crime. And I was thinking about this, and it seems to me that a real tough on crime policy would be a policy that makes the streets safer in the long run. It would be a policy that stops people committing crimes. It would be a policy that deals with the problems that lead to drug addiction. It would be a good public policy that cares for the mentally ill in the community before they end up in the court system. It would be doing smart policy around crime rather than soundbite policy. And I hope actually that in my book I lay out a framework by which progressives can reclaim the mantle of being tough on crime. Because nobody wants to live in a society racked by crime. It's not as if liberals are saying, yes, we want criminals on the street, and yes, we want more drug addiction, and yes, we want more crime. That's obviously not the case. Nobody wants crime. We differ on the solutions. We differ on the ways in which we can approach a less crime-ridden society. And I really do think it's time to have a very wide-ranging discussion about why conservatives have been allowed to claim the mantle of tough on crime with these bad policies.
Now, although we do have this incredibly large prison population, with it goes an incredible financial burden. But you highlight a few groups in America. American Furies that are advocating for even tougher and longer sentences out there, and that would come with an increased cost as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I tease apart is this notion that as a nation we've become a nation of victims. We're a nation that lives in fear. We live in fear of drugs. We live in fear of social decay. We live in fear of urban disorder. Today we live in fear of terrorism, etc. And oftentimes our public policies, unfortunately, are defined more by fear than by rationality. Now, the title of my book sort of in some ways refers to this. It's a play. The title American Furies is a play on this ancient Greek myth of the 3 Furies. And the 3 Furies, or in Greek it was called the Erinyes, were goddesses of the ancient Mediterranean who could be conjured up by crime victims to chase criminals around the Mediterranean and eventually into their grave. And they were portrayed as these sort of wild-eyed, long-haired, demonic goddesses. And they were psychologically this very, very powerful image for maintaining social order in antiquity. And in my book, I talk about how periodically in human history, at different times in different countries, fear of crime takes on an almost mythological proportion, and responses to crime as a result become way larger than life. One good case in point, obviously, would be the epidemic of witch burnings in medieval Europe, when you had thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of people all over Europe burnt, hanged, beheaded, boiled alive, and just dispatched in gruesome ways because there was this hysteria about a satanic compact that was designed to undermine society. Now, obviously, we're not in an age of witch burning, but I do think the way we've approached drugs, especially in America in the last 30 years, approaches a social hysteria. And the responses, the amount of money we've thrown at building prisons, the kinds of prisons we've chosen to build, the way in which prisons have seeped into the popular culture, into TV shows and so on. There is something, to my mind, almost mythological about it. And there's certainly interesting philosophical and religious stories to be told in telling the story of America today in the age of mass incarceration.
Now, Sasha, let's talk about drug policy. The last report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the Department of Justice reported a 40% increase in federal prisoners, and that report noted that it was mainly due to drug prohibition violations. You know, we know over 750,000 people each year get arrested for marijuana violations alone. So, you know, is drug policy and prohibition in particular the reason we have such a large amount of prisoners today?
Well, it's not the only reason, but it's certainly a large reason. And I guess I should explain what has gone on in the last 20, 25 years around the way we deal with drugs. Because for people growing up today, the default, the norm is that there is this thing called a war on drugs, that the police have tremendous leeway in going after drug users and drug dealers, and that the courts have tremendous power to sentence people not just to a couple of years in prison, but oftentimes to decades in prison. And that's the norm for a young person growing up today. But that wasn't always the case, and one of the things that's always fascinated me, not just about crime and punishment issues, but about any social issue I've written about, is the idea that we're always in flux, that what we are and what we're about to become are never the same, that what we were and what we are now is never the same. We're always a society in movement. And one of the ways that we've completely revamped ourselves in the last generation is around the war on drugs. So what you see today is you see people being arrested for low-end drug offenses that in the past police officers would generally have ignored. Once they're arrested, they're put into a judicial system which now has mandatory sentencing laws, which politicians have put on the books. And the mandatory sentencing laws essentially take away the discretion of the courts. So if you're in New York and you face certain drug charges, if you're found guilty, you're going to go to prison for several decades. The same in Louisiana. The same in almost every state in the country to one degree or another. If you're found guilty of a variety of drug offenses, there's no option other than to put you in prison for a long period of time. Now, when you look at what that's done to the prison population, you talked about the federal system, and that's a fantastic example to start with. The federal system today has nearly 200,000 inmates, which is almost, not quite, but almost about 8 times higher than a generation ago. So it's gone from having about 20, 25, 30,000 inmates to having nearly 200,000 inmates. Almost all of the growth in that is due to drugs. Not all of it, but almost all of it. If you get if you get arrested on a federal drug charge, you are going to be prosecuted these days. And if you're prosecuted, in more than 90% of the cases now, you're going to go to prison. And if you go to prison every single year for the last 20 years, the average length of sentence that's been handed down in federal court for drugs has gone up. What that means is more people are serving time in prison for drugs, and once they're in prison, they're serving time for longer. Now, if you take it down to the state level, it's not quite so extreme, but it's almost the same. You see that every single year in state courts in America today, over 30% of the cases that are tried for drugs. And again, if you get sentenced on a drug conviction in a state court, the chances are you're going to prison now unless you become an informant. And if you go to prison, the chances are you're going to get a very, very long sentence. Now, a lot of people have said, well, so what? You know, these guys are bad guys. They've done terrible things. They're a nuisance. Why should we care? And I think there are a couple of reasons. One of them is just the finances. You know, this is an extraordinarily expensive way to deal with a social problem. If you lock someone up for 10 years, you're basically making $500,000 to a $1 million investment in them. If you decide to invest at the front end in drug treatment programs, in better education in inner cities and so on, in better job training programs, and all of the things that could actually lower the drug problem, it would cost less and it would be more effective. And many groups like the RAND Corporation, many groups around America have studied this and said the cost benefits far outweigh, the cost benefits of going in at the front end are far better than waiting and doing it through the prison system. So there's definitely a financial reason to care about this. And the other reason is moral, and that's that when a society starts handing out 20 and 30-year prison sentences as if they're candy, that society has become a very cruel place to live. And in my book, I talk about how many of the top Nuremberg defendants, the Nazi war criminals who were tried at Nuremberg after World War II, many of those defendants received prison sentences instead of execution. The very top tier were executed, but most of the remaining ones received prison sentences. In almost every instance, those sentences were less than 20 years. And the reason was that 20 years was seen as about as draconian a sentence as possible. It was seen as definitive a statement of society's opprobrium as was possible. Now, if you give someone like Albert Speer, who was Hitler's closest confidant, if you give Albert Speer 20 years, and you then fast forward 50 or 60 years to contemporary America, and you find that 2-bit drug hustlers on inner city street corners are now getting 30-year sentences in many cases, there's something out of whack, because what we're saying as a society is we're now more comfortable giving a low-end drug offender 30 years than our grandparents were giving a top Nazi war criminal 30 years. And that, to me, is extraordinary if that's the kind of society we're in the process of becoming.
We're with author Sasha Abramsky discussing his newest book, American Furies, Crime, Punishment, and Vengeance in the Age of Mass Imprisonment. We have links to the book on our website at normalaudiostash.com. Sasha, you mentioned prison culture having a big influence on American culture in general here. We've seen dozens of movies and TV shows and music that use prison culture and the prison experience for entertainment, really. But, you know, in all of this, there is no real expectation that going to prison is going to rehabilitate a criminal anymore. I mean, I don't think anyone's under a guise that if you go to prison, you're going to come out better off. In fact, you're much more likely to be much worse off. And that's sort of the expectation right now, isn't it?
I think it is, and it's actually really ironic, because when you look into the history books and try and work out why America's prisons were started, they were actually started as something of a radical social experiment. The first prisons were Quaker experiments in colonial America, and they were called a quote-unquote holy experiment. And the idea of the holy experiment was that they were going to stand in contradiction to European practices of mass execution, deportations, or physical maiming of convicted prisoners. They were going to stand as this progressive Enlightenment-style beacon. And in the very early years of the U.S. Republic, in New York and in Pennsylvania and a few other states, these very expensive penitentiaries began to be built. And they were built based on Enlightenment notions, based on the writings of men like Cesare Beccaria, who was this Italian aristocrat in the 1760s, or Jeremy Bentham, who was the founder of utilitarian philosophy in England. And they were based on the idea you could take bad people and you could put them in a decent environment and you could play around with their setting, play around with the environment that they lived in, play around with the people who surrounded them, and at the end of the day you can make them better. You can make them more productive citizens, you can make them more respectful of society's laws and so on. Now, it might well be that those penitentiaries never ever worked, that it was always this sort of somewhat utopian hope. But that was the hope. That was the reason given to Americans 200 years ago for building these prisons. Now, again, if you sort of fast forward through history, that rehabilitation ideal has been lost. And you're quite right. If you have watched Oz, if you've in any way, shape, or form come into contact with the prison and popular culture today, you'll know that the expectation now is not rehabilitation, but it's brutalization. And it's almost become a sort of game of toughmanship, who can out-tough the other person. So people going to prison is almost seen as a rite of passage. People come out of prison. In some communities, they're seen as the big guy, the tough guy, because they've survived tough conditions. There's no expectation anymore, or no serious expectation, that large super-maximum security prisons like Pelican Bay in California or Tams in Illinois or any of the huge prisons that have opened up in Texas, there's no real expectation they're going to make people better. They're basically seen as warehouses. In my book, I say they're somewhat like the Babylonian idea of hell, which was this storehouse for the dead. They're these places where you lock away people in extraordinary security environments, and they become out of sight, out of mind. They're where our society now puts our worst nightmares, if you like. Now, the problem is that even in a supermax prison, almost everybody who goes in comes out. It's only about 5% of inmates who will never come out of prison. All the rest of those people come out eventually, and they come out into the community, and they are going to interact in the community, at least in part based on how they were treated inside prison. Now, obviously, my book's fairly reportage-heavy, and my articles over the years have been very reportage-heavy, so I've talked to a lot of prisoners, and I've written to a lot of prisoners. And so many of them have used this analogy about beating a dog, and what will happen when you then get the dog so angry that he finally bites back. And that's, numerous prisoners have written to me that that's what they feel, that they're put in this almost untenable situation. They're routinely brutalized. They're often kept in their cells 23 or even 24 hours a day. Sometimes they're fed through holes in the doors in their cells. They're routinely involved in physical confrontations with guards. And I'm not saying these prisoners are starry-eyed and innocent. Oftentimes the prisoners do terrible things and it triggers the guards' reactions. But for whatever reasons, the prisons are extraordinarily brutal places. Now, what happens when you then cycle those people back into the community? And we release 600,000 people a year. And I think this comes back to the notion that I was talking about earlier. Why should conservatives claim the mantle of being tough on crime just because they put in place stupid public policy around criminal justice? It seems to me if you really want to get tough on crime, you listen to the experts, people who've worked inside prisons for decades, who really know how to set in place programs that can try and rehabilitate people.
Sasha, you spent a lot of time interviewing those involved with the prisons administration out there. I was struck with how many were willing to point out the mistakes of our system and our policies. You know, these individuals involved with prisons, the guards unions are some of the most powerful unions out there, not to mention the influence now of the private prison industry. But, also being part of law enforcement, these folks are usually very insular and their peers don't look very kindly on mistakes in practice and policy being highlighted at all from anyone on the inside.
That's right. I mean, in California, for example, the California Correctional Peace Officers Association is probably the most nefarious political force around crime and punishment in the state. And it's routinely lobbied against prison reform. It's routinely put its own members' interests before the interests of the society at large. The private prison industry obviously has a huge vested interest in keeping the prison population large and keeping the prisoners flowing in because that's where the money is for them. So there are these vested interest groups inside corrections that want nothing to do with reform. On the other hand, there are people who've made a career, a civil service career, out of working in the prisons. And they're very decent people, and they're performing a very necessary task. They're running a prison system, and all states are going to need a prison system. The argument is more about size and conditions than about the existence of the prisons itself. And so these men and women have worked for decades inside the system, and they've seen what kind of programs work. They've seen that if you put in education programs and drug treatment programs and so on, you can actually intervene in a prisoner's life. And they've also seen what is politically popular. And as the politics has gotten more conservative, oftentimes these administrators have been ordered to do things like take away education rights, reduce access to libraries for prisoners, maybe take away exercise facilities, maybe make it harder for prisoners to visit their family members, and so on. And many of these administrators are deeply unhappy with what they've been asked to do, and they feel that it's made their prisons less safe. They feel that it doesn't rehabilitate people, and that all they're seeing is the same people cycling again and again through their system. So they get released, they go onto parole, they may stay out for a year, they may stay out for 2 years, but usually they end up back in prison because they haven't been offered the opportunity to rehabilitate. And so many of these administrators, when you talk to them, they're highly critical of the politics around crime and punishment, especially the politics since about 1980, let's say. And they've told me, they said, we needed to make certain reforms. We might have been too liberal at a certain moment in the 60s and 70s, but the reforms went overboard. And there was one person in Arizona, and this was a sort of state which fascinated me because at the local level, the county jails are extremely tough, quote unquote, and extremely punitive and humiliation-based. But at the state level, the prison administration is actually doing a very good job of trying to reform a very brutalized system. And they're dealing with 2 decades of conservative drift in penal policy in Arizona. And the top administrators in the Arizona prison system sat down and said to me, look, we went into punitive overdrive. And at a certain point, we just began taking things away from prisoners because it was fun to do almost. It was politically acceptable. And it made us look tough on crime. So we started taking away this and that and the other. And the end result, they said, is this lockdown prison environment where guards and inmates never interact on a human basis, where there's this continual underlying tension and where everything is security-driven and nothing is rehabilitation-based. And I was struck by this, that, a top administrator in a major prison system would just readily acknowledge the wrong turns that have gone on because of political choices. It seemed to me that was a very stark demonstration of the power of the soundbite to override good social policy.
We've been speaking with author Sasha Abramsky. His newest book is American Furies, Crime, Punishment, and Vengeance in the Age of Mass Imprisonment. We have links for more information about the book at normalaudiostash.com. We'll speak again with Sasha next week, right here on the Audio Stash.
Slavery is back. In fact, it was never abolished. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery, except in prison. At the current rate of incarceration, by the year 2010, the majority of all African American men between 18 and 40 will be in prison, the state as their captor.
It's going to take people who are willing to fight, not people who want to negotiate with the enemy.
Prison, prison, prison.
The pits of life containment, where reform and discipline are labeled enslavement. From rites of passage to stacking the raiments, been sporting the iron bars, just gracing the pavement. It's just like cavemen from the pages of myth, cohabitating in darkness while we wallow in filth. Generations of jewels will trickle down to abyss, as blood stains these prisons like the pyramid glyphs. Guilty or innocent agents of government treat our hoods like picking ground. Schools to tenement, all sagging uniform as thugs. They represent racial stereotypes, a profile for the oppressed. When you witness genocide every day, you get the hint that the ghettos are cold like a lab experiment. As young women and men street hustle before they 10, graduating from juvenile halls and up the river to the
76% of Americans no longer support arresting and jailing marijuana smokers, and nearly as many support the medical patients having access to medical marijuana. And over 80% of our citizens now believe the war on drugs is an ineffective failure. So the question is, when will the government's misguided war on adult marijuana smokers finally end? When? Simple. When you and your like-minded friends, family, and coworkers get involved with an organization such as the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, also known as NORML. My name is Keith Stropp, and I founded the organization in 1970. Contact us at NORML, toll-free, 888-67-NORML, or by visiting the organization's up-to-date webpage at www.norml.org.
Listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Make sure you visit our website at normalaudiostash.com. That's NORMLAUDIOSTASH.com for more information about every day's show. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Thanks for listening today. See you at 4:20 tomorrow. The podcasting technology of NORML is made possible by Red Aphid Interactive Media. More information at redapphid.com.